This is Walter Leite, and in this presentation we'll talk about sources of survey error and how to minimize them. So error is when there is a difference between an estimate obtained by the sample and the population. Survey errors can cause unreliability or can cause bias. Variance or unreliability is when there is an inconsistent difference between estimates and the population parameters, meaning that every time you repeat the survey you would get a different randomly varying estimate. Okay, so unreliability causes standard errors to be increased, but does not bias the responses in a specific direction. Unreliability can come from item no response. This is when individuals skip an item. So it's important to differentiate between item no response and survey no response. Survey no response is done when an individual just decides not to respond to the survey. Item no response causes missing data. In other words, you do have some responses for that individual, but not the entire survey. Interviewer error is when an interviewer makes a random mistake that's not related to anything specifically, and such as skipping a word in the instructions. And poor question design would be things that lead to variation in interpretation, but there's variation but not in a consistent way, and that is why it's a source of unreliability. If the question design generates responses that are incorrect in a consistent way, that would be bias. So for sources of unreliability related to question design, we have poor item wording, which means that the responses are interpreted in different ways by the respondents. Vague quantifiers such as strongly agree to strongly disagree, frequently, sometimes, occasionally. These are vague quantifiers because the interpretation of them vary between respondents. So for example, if you ask someone how frequently do I attend religious services, and you use always, frequently, occasionally, and never, some respondents may think frequently is once a week, some other respondents may think frequently is once a day. Now, ranking items cause unreliability because they're difficult. They require individuals to keep a lot of information in their mind. And also, long lists of items cause unreliability because, such as matrix questions that have a big block of items, because individuals may not pay much attention to the items since they're blocked, so compacted in a matrix question. Also, mark all that apply questions create unreliability because individuals may not pay attention to all the items equally. Primacy and recency effects in long list of options cause unreliability because for primacy in self-administered surveys, primacy means that individuals will pay more attention to the first options, but this varies from person to person. And recency effects is for interviewer administered surveys, where if you have a long list of options, individuals will pay more attention to the last ones that were mentioned, but this again, because it varies from person to person, this causes unreliability. Some people can keep long list of items in their memories better than others, right? And some people may be paying more attention to the list of items than others. So bias is a consistent difference between the sample and the population parameters. This means that if you repeat the survey with another sample, you get a difference in the same direction. Inadequate coverage is a source of bias because this means that some part of the population is systematically not being surveyed. So this could be rural individuals in rural areas. It could be younger individuals. It could be due to poor sampling frame. In other words, so for example, if you have a sampling frame of emails, maybe older individuals are not represented, or their emails, they tend not to check those emails, or the emails are incorrect. But it could also be due to unit no response, which is unit no response is when some individuals systematically respond at lower rates to the survey, right? So it may be that younger members of the population tend to discard the survey more frequently. And response bias would be, ways that the survey is being systematically responded in a way that's different to the true values. So order effects, acquiescence, social desirability bias. Order effects could be due to, for example, monitoring for consistency response across items. Acquiescence would be the tendency of agreeing. Social desirability bias is the tendency to respond in a social desirable direction, and that for the same population could always be elicit this type of response. And it could also come from interview administered surveys from inadequate interaction between respondent and interviewer. So when can you prevent these problems that may result in either unreliability or bias to happen? Inadequate coverage would be addressed in the survey planning stage, because you can evaluate the sampling frame and see if some groups are systematically being excluded, or if there are more incorrect information in the sampling frame for some groups. Unit no responses is survey implementation. Use methods such as mixed mode surveys to make sure that no group of individuals has lower response rates. Item response is addressed in the survey design, so people don't skip questions. And in strategies like clear skip patterns or careful placement of more sensitive questions may minimize item no response. Response bias is addressed in the survey design. So, for example, ways to minimize social desirability bias would alleviate response bias. Also in the implementation, particularly if it's interview administered surveys, because things like social desirability bias are more prevalent in interview administered surveys. And bias due to interviewer error, inadequate interview interaction, you would prevent that in survey training. So I will go in more detail about some of these measures. For inadequate coverage during survey planning, try to understand your sampling frame, what is in there, what's missing, and maybe ask questions from the organization that provided you with the sampling frame. Do they know of any group that is more systematically excluded? Do they know if there are ineligibles in the sampling frame? How old is the sampling frame? If it's a sampling frame of emails, does it get updated regularly? You may be able to combine different sampling frames. If you have a sampling frame from one organization that consists of emails and another organization that consists of emails, you can cross them and see if they match. If one has addresses, you can combine and do a mixed mode survey. For preventing unit no response, the entire implementation procedure should be designed to minimize unit no response. So techniques like writing a good cover letter, having a pre-notes letter that's sent by someone that's important to the respondent, writing a cover letter that actively communicates the importance of the survey, having contacts of different types increasingly strong, such as following up an email with a paper postcard or a letter, or following up an email survey with a replacement questionnaire by mail, using incentives. This is all ways to prevent unit non-response. Now, unfortunately, even when you get high response rates, you may have non-response bias. So, if, for example, if you get a 90% response rate, it may be that those 10% that did not respond overrepresent systematically a group that has different opinions with respect to the questions of those surveys. So, even though you may take good care in maximizing the response rate, there is always potential for non-response bias. Item non-response is when individuals skip items in the survey. This is particularly problematic when it's a source of bias because some individuals systematically skip some questions. And if they're skipping some questions for reasons unrelated to the survey, such as the skip pattern is not clear, that's a bit less problematic because the data will be missing completely at random. Now, if they're skipping questions for reasons related to the question itself, such like there is a question about binge drinking, and they are skipping it because they are engaged in binge drinking regularly, that provides data that's missing, not at random, and it's very problematic. It's hard to deal with. It's about making sure that individuals don't accidentally skip questions by not having large groups of matrix questions, but also managing sensitive questions that could be skipped on purpose. You can minimize item response also by preventing not using difficult questions such as ranking questions, and asking them not to make difficult calculations in the survey. How can you diagnose? This is not perfect. At adequate coverage, you can compare your sampling frame with census data and other secondary sources, and examine statistics for your sampling frame as compared to census. For unit non-response, you can look at your response rates and compare with population proportions that exist. That is, you can remediate somewhat a non-response bias problem if you have data from the population that you can use to create weights. That would be non-response weights that try to adjust your sample proportions to match the known population proportions. Item non-response, you can do analysis of patterns of missing data and use methods for missing data in the analysis such as multiple imputation, but it's better to avoid having to deal with missing data later, particularly if your missing data is missing not at random, where the reason for missingness is related to the variable itself. It's hard to account for that in the analysis step. Interview error can be detected by interviewer debriefing, by listening to recorded versions of the interview. Now, survey sensitive topics is difficult because of potential for social desirability bias, potential for just skipping questions, and it's Some questions can be clearly identified as sensitive, such as a question about binge drinking or about plagiarism. Other questions are not so easy to determine if they are sensitive or not. Some questions may be sensitive for some groups but not others, and those are hard to identify. Focus groups for pre-testing may allow you to detect that some questions are sensitive, but it is definitely harder to do. Expert reviews may help you as well to detect whether these questions are sensitive. So sensitive survey questions may lead to sampling problems. You may have a difficult sampling. For example, if you are trying to survey about drinking, maybe alcoholics will be hard to sample, and then survey no response will result also because they may see the sensitive question, just skip it, or skip responding to the survey altogether, or you may get missing data where they partially respond to the survey, or social desirability bias when they don't give you the accurate answers, but the answers that they believe is socially desirable, right? So, do you ever engage in binge drinking? They would say, no, never, because it's not socially desirable. For populations difficult to identify, you may be able to do pre-screening of the population, but sometimes you have to resort to snowball sampling if it's really hard to identify the population, in which case you use known individuals to help you identify other individuals of the population. To reduce survey no response, the methods for design of adequate cover letter, pre-notes letter, and every contact with the respondent will help you reduce survey no response as well as incentives. Item no response and social desirable responses. Sensitive questions should never be at the beginning of the survey. You may want to frame it with other not as threatening questions, put it together like a question sandwich. No threatening questions, some more threatening questions, followed by no threatening questions. And write the question in a way that's non-incriminating, non-emotive, neutral.